I'd like to welcome you all to the Langley Adams Library in Groveland. It's one of our last programs for the month of March for the Groveland Gathers to Read, and I'm a little sad about that. It's been a really fun month, and I'll be looking forward to the next time we do it because it's been a lot of fun programs to have. And today we have Christina Hodge, who's the Senior Curatorial Assistant at the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. She's going to be here to talk to us about the Harvard Indian College back in the 1660s and also talk about what it's like now as they are digging up, having archaeological digs. And I also just wanted to let you know of a couple upcoming programs that are happening. Monday, we are having Charlotte Gordon, 6:30, who's going to be talking about her book, Mistress Bradstreet. And this coming Saturday, we will be having Delvin Case, who will be talking about the Beatles. And that will be at 11 in the morning, and that's from 11 to 12:30. So I hope you all enjoy this, and I've been looking forward to it for quite some time. And thank you very much for coming. And here is Christina Hodge. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming today. I'm really pleased to have been invited to speak about the Harvard Yard Archaeology Project here at the Langley Adams Library, and especially within the speaker series. I was sort of looking at the list of folks who have come through related to the Caleb's Crossing reading and other readings this month, and it's a good list of folks and a lot of different perspectives about the 17th century that it sounds like you're being introduced to, so that's really lovely. So as Diana said, my name's Christina Hodge. I'm a historical archaeologist. That means that the archaeology I do, the excavations I do, are focused on what we call the colonial period of North America. So everything basically after English culture and English people started showing up afterwards. And that means in the 17th century that there was a lot of changes going on for Native American people as well as for the English people who were first coming to settle and occupy and create new communities here in New England. And the story of Caleb's Crossing, the story of Harvard in its early years, especially the Harvard Indian College, is one piece of that story of transformation and culture change from that period of time. So I'm going to be focusing on what's going on at Harvard, and then doing a little bit of talking about the broader context, sort of historical context, religious context, cultural contexts in which Harvard was founded, and especially in which the Indian College was founded as kind of an experiment during these early years. And then I'll also be talking to you all about some of the archaeological finds that we've actually been excavating at present-day Harvard, even though the Indian College, all of the 17th century buildings at the school are no longer standing, but traces of them still remain underground. So we're very lucky to have the opportunity to do archaeology at this very special place and recover some of these traces of people, including Caleb and lots of other young men and a few women who were there at Harvard during these time periods. All right, so a little bit about the context, although a lot of this will sound familiar given the kinds of stuff you guys have been reading and listening to in the present weeks. So the main sort of questions we have when we start thinking about, why are we interested in history? Why are we interested in this particular history? What can we learn about 17th century Harvard? Really, we just have very basic sort of motivations. It was a long time ago, not long in the universal sense, but in the human sense and in the sense that there's been a lot of changes between the 17th century and the present day. We sort of have an idea of what things were like, but we're never really sure. And we have a lot of biases and prejudices, and the stories that have been handed down through history are not necessarily the most objective ones. So it's always a good idea to think back and try to understand actually what it was like for people at the time and what other stories we might tell. So we're really interested in just learning what 17th century New England was like, what Harvard itself was like in the 17th century. It was a very, very different school than it is today. You know, Harvard today is globally known, behemoth, you know, financially beyond stable, all of this stuff. Not true in the 17th century. So getting beyond our current prejudices and conceptions about Harvard is part of it too. And we're also interested in what life was like at the Indian College. There are a few written records about it, but none by people who are actually living there. So it's a very sort of one-sided and very sparse written history about life at the Indian College. But it was a very dynamic, very, for the time, progressive colonial institution. And so really trying to understand as much as we can about what life was like there involves looking at these documents, but also involves listening to descendant communities like the Wampanoag community and their stories about the young men who went to Harvard and the Indian College in the 17th century, and also looking at what we can find through the study of material culture. So through things and building foundations and through spaces, and that's what we can get at through archaeology. So again, general 17th century contexts, what was going on, especially from the English perspective, during 1630s through 1660s. Plymouth was 1620, Boston was settled, Charlestown was settled 1630, Cambridge, Harvard area, then called Newtown, was settled at about the same time. So very, very early in England's colonial history in this area. And the general motivation for moving hundreds and eventually thousands of English men and women across the Atlantic to the New World, to New England, was complicated and had many facets, but one of the most important in terms of where the institutional motivation was coming from and also where the money was coming from was the religious motivation. There was an idea on the part of Governor Winthrop and others in the early community that England had become too corrupt, England had become too papist, they needed to reform the Protestant church, and they needed something like a clean slate to do this. Of course, New England was never a clean slate, and there were always people here doing many things. However, English prejudice and lack of understanding being what it was, they decided that the area around Boston Harbor was an ideal place to found this ideal, utopian in some ways, city on a hill community, a beacon for God, for other people that will show the righteous way to combine godly living and social organization and community well-being in sort of this new land of New England. So it's a combination of this Puritan religious idealism, which did not separate church and state. There was really no separation there. So again, trying to get beyond our modern prejudices to understand that. And also to sort of live this ideal in their daily lives. Now, of course, there were people here. There were thousands of Native Americans of various tribes and nations here when the English sort of showed up in the early to mid 17th century. And so, given the realities of dealing with the indigenous people here, the English sort of made sense of them according to their own priorities and their own understanding, which meant that there was a lot of prejudice against Native American people, the way they dressed or did not dress, their religious beliefs were sort of not understood and were considered heathenish and sinful and semi-human even by some of the English. There was a very deep prejudice and bias and misunderstanding going on there. So part of the justification then for coming over became not just settling and creating an ideal English society, but converting and changing Native American people, Native American society as well, to meet the English model. There's a deep irony there, given that the early English settlers, the Puritans, were escaping a system in England that would not let them practice their beliefs freely. It wasn't necessarily about religious freedom, although we hear about that. It was about their freedom and power to practice your religion and to also make other people practice your religion, which they didn't get in England, but they got to a greater extent here. So I'm also highlighting here in some of these images, this is a 19th century image, imagined image of the missionary John Eliot proselytizing to Native Americans, and then an actual 1659 portrait of John Eliot from the Native Historical Society as well. But this idea of conversion really depending on literacy is a really key idea within Puritan belief systems. Puritans, compared with other religious orders, compared with other cultures, really had a higher literacy rate because they believed people had to read the Bible to understand their relationship with God. And so to proselytize even to Native Americans, part of their goal was to get Native Americans reading the Bible, reading the Psalms, reading the Gospel, in order to understand the Puritan religion. That was just how it was done. And so that's why you see Eliot with all these books, including, I don't know if you can see it here, but this says gospel in some funky letters, and that is a signal of his proselytizing to the Indians, to the Wampanoag in Massachusetts and other groups, was done partially in English, but also partially in native languages, in indigenous languages. And so that's a really important piece of the story as well. This is a slide just giving you a bit of a geographic orientation. The big H here is Harvard, still is. So that's where Harvard's at, and where some of these early communities were. But Harvard was within a vast network of pre-existing native centers and villages and temporary camps and trails. Places were connected by rivers and waterways. It was a very complex, dynamic set of communities. And Harvard early on was connected through Native people to a lot of these Native centers throughout southeastern New England, especially Massachusetts. So these highlighted areas had individuals from these communities who lived or worked or both at Harvard. So you had people from Chebunkamon and Hassanamisset and Natick, Ponkapog, and of course Mashpee on the Cape, as well as Gayhead or Aquina on Martha's Vineyard, which is the community that Caleb Chushtamak and Joel Byakuns were both from the vineyard. And so these are all just some of the native communities. You can see all the other sort of main centers, larger centers named here that had direct ties to Harvard. So it was a sort of a node within a network is a way to think of the early school. So let's think about the early school. I don't know how much people know about early Harvard. Having been at Harvard these many years now, I have, take a lot for granted about what people know about Harvard in general. But just to introduce you a little bit to the early school and its founding. This is a little bit later view, but it's the earliest one we have. It's a 1723 view of Harvard College, or by that point, Harvard University, with these brick buildings. If you go to Harvard today, this is sort of the main entrance into campus still. This building's not there anymore, but if you keep looking, you'll see sort of the John Harvard statue, which is our most iconic thing people take pictures of in the yard, in the Harvard yard right now. But this view of Harvard is after Harvard had been around for almost 100 years already by the time it looked like this. Earlier, Harvard was a lot smaller, less institutional looking, kind of a dodgy proposition. What we know as Cambridge was initially founded as Newtown in the early 1730s. This is a early map, 1735 map of Boston and surroundings. Charlestown and Roxbury and Boston's here, Dorchester, Great Blue Hill, the Charles River coming through here. Medford is there, and then here you see Newtown, which was the original name of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Not the most inventive name in the world, but such it was early on. Another thing to note about this map is you see these little English town symbols with all these kind of spirey looking, semi-churchy looking buildings for all the English communities that were already being established by the 1630s. But then also in the map you have, as you go north, sort of other things going on. And these are wigwams or wetus, which is a native structure, some smaller, some larger. And that was the type of building that native groups in New England most often used. And so even on this very early map, the cartographers acknowledging that both of these things are going on, that there's a lot of native folks out there, that they've got their own styles and cultures. So Harvard itself was established as an institution, Harvard College, in 1636. That's only a few years after Charlestown, Boston themselves were started. So it was a pretty bold move on the part of the early settlers to establish a college so early in the settlement. It was initially known as the College at Newtown, or the Old College at Newtown, and for almost 100 years it was the only college that we had here in New England. It finally opened in 1638 with one master, 9 young men, 15-ish years old, give or take, in a house. And those were the humble beginnings of Harvard College. The early master's name was Nathaniel Eaton. He and his wife took care of the young men, not very well. They ended up in court for beating students, for stealing funds, for feeding the students truly disgusting fare with, fish with guts in it and rotten butter, and we'll leave it at that. But you can go read the court transcriptions if you like and hear all about Mistress Eaton's misdeeds with the food and Master Eaton's misdeeds with his cudgel. So I know some of that comes up in the book, and that is based in documentary evidence from the time period. So there's scrupulous research behind the book. Yes.
Is it known how Eaton was appointed?
Well, he was connected to a lot of the leaders because of his time at Magdalen College at University of Cambridge in Old Cambridge. And so when the school was founded here, he was among those who came to the New World seeking, religious opportunities and opportunities just to be a minister. And so he knew the right people, basically. He talked a good game, it sounded like, also. But given when he had the power, there's this is the story of history. It could be spin against Eaton to some extent, but there's definite not great stuff going on underneath Eaton's tenure. So it was a bit of a sketchy start for Harvard. What little funds they had were, a bunch of it was lost. There's this scandal with the Eatons, and so it was a bit of a rocky beginning for this experimental school at the time. This is what Harvard Yard looked like, where Harvard began. This is Braintree Street. If you're familiar with Cambridge or Harvard these days, this is Massachusetts Avenue now. These are some of the earliest houses that were built. Most of the city was down to the south here between Braintree Street and the Charles River. This was kind of the fringe of the city. It was marshy land. Nobody wanted to build there. They put the cows there to kind of freely graze. That's what was going on. But that meant that these houses had large lots opening up to a shared ox and sheep pasture lot and more sort of open land up here. And that's where the early founders, the overseers of Harvard, decided to purchase properties and build the school and sort of expand into the cow yards. So Harvard Yard has, this open space surrounded by buildings in the middle of the campus has always been Harvard Yard. But it was called Harvard Yard to distinguish it from the pre-existing cow yard. So it was the yard for Harvard instead of the yard for cows, which nobody really thinks about these days, but I find hilarious. So that's, these are the, romantic beginnings of Harvard College. You're in this really muddy, marginal, I'm sure very odoriferous cow pasture. That was where Harvard was. So these two houses here, Olmsted and Braintree House, were the first 2 one-acre properties that Harvard purchased. So it was around Pine Tree that the house where Eaton lived was, and then they very soon purchased the Olmsted House as well. So these were converted to university buildings, and then this couple of acres was what Harvard Yard consisted of for the early years. And this is artist's reconstruction of what that might have looked like with Goff and Pine Tree House here, an orchard that was planted that we know about from documents, and sort of these fenced-in areas backing onto the larger cow yard with a lot of, cows and trash and privies and things like this everywhere. Yeah.
How do you pronounce G-O-F-F-E?
Goff.
Okay.
Yep. Goff. but we don't know that this is what it looked like. We don't have any maps of Harvard. We don't have any drawings of Harvard Yard or of these houses from the time period. So this is based on partial documents, but it's a reconstruction. And so one of the things archaeology is hoping to do is to dig into the ground to see what we can find, to do what we call ground truthing of all these stories. So once Harvard bought those 2 lots, they kept adding and adding lots around there, so that by the time you're into the 1660s, the college yard is a bit bigger. It includes these first 2 properties, but stretches more towards the north. It's adjacent to Cambridge Common, which was still used for sheep grazing. We've got a nugget out of it for the meeting house, but besides that, Gough was still there. Paintree House was the president's lodging. And then in the starting in the 1640s and 1650s, Harvard started building institutional buildings. The first one was the 1642 Old College, which was built here. Started under Eaton. He took some of the money. That was not great. The first president after Eaton, Henry Dunster, continued building that. That was Dunster's first priority. And then next to that, in the 1650s, is the Indian College. And I'll talk a little bit more about the motivations behind the Indian College in a little bit. But first, the Old College building was built. This was a 3.5, 4-story structure built of wood, no basement, bad foundations, started falling apart almost as soon as they put it up, but it was an institutional building. A fair and comely edifice with a hall so students could all eat together, student rooms, a library where the donation that gave the school its name could be stored. Harvard in these early years, I said, was financially struggling. The college at Newtown was struggling, but when the minister, John Harvard, died in 1638, he was nearby. He thought the school was an amazing idea and wanted to see it thrive and prosper, so he donated his library, which was installed in the first floor, or second floor rather, of the Old College. He also donated hundreds of pounds of his personal estate to make sure Harvard would succeed when it was so unstable in these early years. And then that was the only building for the early years. You had those 2 houses and the Old College building. And then Harvard's mission sort of shifted a little bit in the 1650s. So, 15 to 20 years after the school started. In 1650, Harvard got its official charter from the government of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which meant that it was legally empowered to make decisions for itself, instead of having to go to the courts every time it wanted to do something. So this is Harvard's charter. It's still the foundational document of the school today. The original 1650 document comes out every time we have a new university president inaugurated. It was part of the regalia that came out to witness Drew Faust's inauguration several years ago. But some of the words in the charter are words that were forgotten for a long time, but we're trying to remind people about them now. And that's that when they wrote this charter, they dedicated Harvard to educate Indian and English youth. Not just English youth, but Indian and English youth in knowledge and godliness. And that is what this college was for, according to its charter of 1650. So what did that actually look like when you start to act on this motivation? Well, part of the reason for including Indian youth along with English youth was this ideal of Puritan conversion and proselytization that I talked about. Also, if you are going to proselytize, you can then plug into fundraising in England and get much more money than you could otherwise from the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in New England and other places, but mainly the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. And so Harvard did that. By dedicating itself to conversion, they could plug into this funding source at a time when they really needed the money. They were, financially not yet stable. So they asked the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel and received funds to build an Indian college at Harvard, next to the Old College for the English students at Harvard. They decided they wanted one entire room at the college for the convenience of 6 hopeful Indian youths to be trained up there. And so they described the building as, brick, 2 stories, strong, durable, not like the old college, which was already falling down. And so it was in 1654 that they started building, and they probably finished around 1655, building this new Indian College building. It was Harvard's first brick building, which was a bit of a statement. We only know of about 10 brick buildings in the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony at that time. Brick was an expensive building material, even though there are local sources for it. So that was a statement towards their investment in this mission. John Eliot, the missionary I mentioned before, you saw his portrait, he was put in charge of the Indian College and of its mission at Harvard. And really the intent was for young Native men to be leaders within their own communities. So not just have English young men ministering to Native communities, but have Native men ministering to Native communities. We only know of 4 Native students, however, who resided in the physical Indian College building. It's not a lot. They've got a big legacy. It's not a lot of numbers. There was Caleb G. Shatayamuk from a Wampanoag community on the vineyard at Quinag. Also his classmate Joel Ayuk Coombs, another young man from Martha's Vineyard. John Wampus, who is Nipmuc, that's a central Massachusetts tribe. He did not graduate. He left to become a mariner before graduating. And Eleazar, we don't know any other names for him, his native name, for example. He was also Wampanoag. We're not sure where he's from. And he died from smallpox before he graduated. Joel died just before graduation, but he did recently receive his posthumous degree in, I think, 2011 or 2010. And it took that long to give it to him. Harvard's very careful with its posthumous degrees, but Joel received his degree finally, very recently. And it was accepted by a young Wampanoag woman, Tiffany Smalley, from the vineyard, from a Wampanoag community on the vineyard. So she was the first graduate since the first graduate from this community, which was Caleb, in 1666. So between 1666 and 2011, there were all of these years where no Wampanoag young men or women graduated from the college. Certainly people attended other schools within the university, but not the undergraduate college in all those hundreds of years. So it was very appropriate, I think, that Tiffany was the one to accept Joel's degree on the behalf of his community and her community. So the Indian College was intended to convert natives. It was a tool. It was an opportunity for natives, but it was also a tool for sort of conversion and oppression. The idea was that, left to their own devices, Native Americans were savages, were, open to Satan, were in peril and imperiling English communities. Children of wrath, we need to reduce them from barbarism to civility. As Daniel Lucan, who was the superintendent for the Indians in the Mass Bay Colony, put it. Also then, the Indian College was a means to do this, a means intended for the good of the Indians, intended to house, about 20 scholars eventually, but even as early as 1674, it was recognized that it hasn't been much used, much improved for the ends intended, by reason of the death and failing of Indian scholars. So as I said, there were only 4 young men who actually lived there. Caleb was the only one who graduated. He died soon after graduation. Everybody else died or left before graduation. So the experiment did not really work out as anyone hoped and reflects some of the larger stresses Native communities were under during this really sort of traumatic dislocation of colonialization in the 17th century. Yes.
Do we know how Puritans interpreted the graduates or the scholars either dying or leaving in terms of how God is?
Yeah, I'm sure they did. We don't have much specific about these particular 4 young men, but in general, the idea that the fact that epidemic diseases and plagues were afflicting Native Americans was something that was interpreted as a sign of the righteousness of settlement, colonization, and conversion. on the part of the English, so that was at least one context, I'm sure, in which this would have been interpreted. I know that in some of Gookin's writings, he speaks of Caleb and Joel and their time at the Indian College, and speaks very, very highly, especially of Joel, as being a model Puritan. So he knew them on a personal level, and so it's not as easy as that. It's a little complicated, I think, at least for some English folks. There's a lot of different opinions going on both sides. This is a portrait of Caleb that was painted in 2010, not of the time period, but an imagining of what Caleb would have looked like when he was studying in the college. So there's a lot of, that's one of the blanks. There are a lot of blanks we need to fill in about this history in terms of just what daily life was like, try to understand opinions, try to understand interactions between English and native students. I mean, this was something that had not happened before anywhere, really. And so this Indian College and Harvard College was the first place this was being attempted, to have young native men meet the same educational standards as the English young men. They knew Hebrew and Greek and Latin. They could write it and speak it. They were definitely fluent in English as well as their own Algonquian language. And they had gone to grammar school. They had passed the tests. They had made it into Harvard. And they were going to classes along with the English students. They were eating along with, praying along with the English students. Even though the Indian College was a separate building where their studies, their bedrooms were, they were joining other students in the hall, at lectures, for food, for prayer, at the old college that had been built in 1642. So there's some dynamic there that we don't get in the documents, but is really, really important for understanding certainly history of Harvard and New England, but English colonialism and the effects of it on native communities as well as English communities in the long term. So in this, just to point out, in this sort of portrait of Caleb, you can see there's a lot of symbolism going on. There's a map of the vineyard. He's writing with a turkey feather as opposed to a goose feather. And then in the corner, the artist has chosen to hang something inspired by what we actually have in the collections of the Peabody Museum at Harvard, which is a bag attributed to Caleb. We don't know if it's really his. A lot of stuff gets written in museums that says a thing is from a famous person, even when it's not. But it's certainly a very important object, an intriguing object, and we haven't found anything yet to prove that it is not Caleb's bag. So we're taking very good care of it, and people from Wampanoag communities and other scholars as well are looking and considering this item and trying to figure out more about it to figure out if we can tie it individually to Caleb or not. So the archaeology project then, to turn to that for the rest of our time, is one of these really, I think, I'm biased, but I think powerful ways of trying to fill in these gaps in history. It's true here, it's true everywhere. A lot of stuff just does not get written down for whatever reason it is. You think about what you do every day that doesn't get written down but is really important, says a lot about you and our society, and this has always been true. It's especially true if you're interested in populations that didn't or couldn't or weren't allowed to write the histories that we all know. So archaeology is another way of getting at what those folks' lives were like, what they used, where they lived, what their lifestyles were, what was important to them, what choices they made. So that's why we have this Indian College initiative within the larger Harvard Yard Archaeology Project. We're very interested in English students and American students and everybody, all the way up through the past 350 plus years. But within that, there's this special interest right now in understanding the Indian College more fully than we do today. So it's an ongoing component of the Harvard Yard Archaeology Project that's based at the Peabody. We're interested in looking at Harvard as a changing and multicultural space from its earliest days, which you don't think of. It seems so English, so colonial, but there were always, Native Americans there. There were Native American students. There were Native American servants. There were Native American people going to classes even if they weren't in the Indian College. There's a man named James Printer who worked the printing press at the Harvard Indian College in the 17th century. I'll talk about him a little bit more too. There are also people of African descent, some enslaved, some not enslaved, in the town of Cambridge with connections to the school. There were women there, some working at the school in the town. It was much more dynamic than just these young men and their tutors. So that's something to think about. So we're interested also in using the project to bring different scholars together and generally to think critically about Harvard's history and sort of relate the past to the present and hopefully also to the future of the school and what's important to the school and sort of where we came from and where we're going as an institution. Sorry, this is a little washed out with the projector, but this is a map of, contemporary map of Harvard Yard. So those early maps I showed were Braintree Street, that's now called Mass Ave. Those first two houses, the Olmsted Goff House and Paintree House, were located basically in what's now the middle of Mass Ave. They were destroyed when the subway line went through, but we do know where those foundations were. And so we know where those first two lots were, those first 2 acres. And the houses were here, the lots stretched this way. And you can see all this 19th century and some 20th century construction around the edges, you know, really impacted and destroyed underground deposits for the most part here. But there's this big open space right there in the middle of Harvard Yard in its earliest properties from the 1630s. And so these 2 red dots are where we've been excavating and finding the most materials from the 17th century in Harvard Yard, because Harvard didn't build there. They put a lot of dirt there. They smoothed all the trash over. They made it less swampy. So we have to dig through several feet of fill to get to the 17th century. But when we do it, there's a thin layer of the 17th century all the way down there in Harvard Yard. So we're very lucky that we were able to find it and that Harvard lets us make a big hole in the middle of Harvard Yard in order to recover it and interpret it for the university community. This is what archaeology in Harvard Yard looks like when we do get to do it. It's a busy place. If you haven't been there, everybody should go hang around. But there's a lot of folks walking through Harvard Yard, and that's a little bit of a challenge. We have to work behind some fencing, but it's also an opportunity to talk to the public and tell them about what we're doing and about this story. So you can see here some of our square excavation units, 1 by 1 meter, that's about 3 by 3 feet square. Some of the students, one of them sitting in here, you can see this is not nearly deep enough to get to the 17th century yet. He's still in the 19th century. Same over here, but it gets pretty deep in there. And then once the dirt is excavated, we sift it through these screens and then pull out any artifacts we find. And this student is holding 2 tiny pieces of lead printing type, which is a very important part of the story that I'll get to in a minute or two. So these are some of the sites that you see when we're actively excavated in Harvard Yard, which we hope to be again in the summer of 2014 and the fall of 2014. So if you're interested in a visit with archaeology, that's when we're hoping to be out there. All right, so this is a conjectural reconstruction of the Indian College based on documents. We were looking for it. It's what we were doing there. We were trying to find the Indian College, digging a bunch of holes, trying to find it. And so eventually, 2007, we found something tempting. 2009, we went back and dug more. Same in 2011. This is what we found in 2009. We dug through the modern fill, through the 19th century fill, all the way down to colonial level deposits, which are almost 4.5 feet down below the current surface, a little bit more in some cases. And we found this orange subsoil, which is there before people, the glacier did it, and it looks orange these days. But then in that, a trench was dug. And it was then, after the trench was dug, it was filled in with the dark topsoil, which is why you get this stripe. So somebody was up to something with this trench. And then in the trench, we found a lot of building materials like brick and foundation stones. We found those pieces of lead printing type. We found materials dating from the 17th century. And so there wasn't much. This is not related to cows, whatever is going on here. This is something else. And what it looks like is the foundation of a building that was, a trench was dug, a shallow foundation was laid in, and then the foundation was removed again and the building materials used elsewhere. And that matches very well with our understanding of the history of the Indian College, which was used, not a lot of native students, housed the printing press up through the 1670s, 1680s, then sort of fell into disuse and disrepair and was taken down in the 1690s, and its building materials were reused elsewhere. So we have a lot of brick, we have a building trench with reused materials, we have printing type, we have 17th century stuff. The only other 17th century building in this part of the yard was the Old College, but that was found and excavated in the 1980s, and that's elsewhere. So we are pretty confident in saying we have found the trench for the actual Indian College building, part of its foundation, and we believe it's this portion of the foundation, the eastern portion, which is where, according to documents, the printing room actually was. So where Harvard had its printing press, which was the only printing press in the colonies at that time. This is another view of some of the excavations. So that's that trench from 2009, and then in 2011 we sort of excavated a little bit more of it here. So this sort of pinkish stripe is that trench running about north-south. There's some other things that we found. You can see all the different layers of fill in this slide especially. This is the trench after the fill with all that building material and 17th century stuff was taken out of it. This is a whole other sort of 1790s kind of a drainage trench that unfortunately impacted, which is a way to say destroyed in archaeology talk, impacted the Indian College Foundation. So we're probably missing big pieces of it here due to all these stones and this drainage trench that was put in. But we do have a run of it, thankfully. And so we've been getting some good materials out of this particular archaeological feature of the Indian College trench. Things like special shaped bricks, which were made to kind of fancify and also make the foundation a little more structurally sound. We get things like this piece of window lead. So those small pieces of glass quarrels that were used in diamond pane windows were held together by lead canes like this. So we have several pieces of window lead. One of our finds right next to the Indian College Foundation trench was this really sweet little fragment of a cup. Students had to bring their own cups to early Harvard. Harvard didn't give them to you. So this was somebody's personal cup that had been imported from England that he used to drink his beer in the morning and afternoon and whatever. So we found that. Students also had to supply their own spoons. So near the trench we found the 17th century Latin, which is a copper alloy 17th century spoon form. You can see here the edge is very, very worn down. So this was not one of the wealthier students. You know, this is not a silver spoon boy, whoever was using this spoon. He was right-handed, and he, you know, wore the heck out of it down, eating his porridges and pottages and whatever he had there. We also find things like wine bottle necks and other pieces of glass wine bottles. We can tell from the shape when they date to. This is a 17th century example. Certainly there was wine on campus, but the students weren't supposed to be drinking it. So that's part of the archaeology story as well, as what students are doing and should not be doing. So we have some evidence of that. And then the printing type. So these small lead, you know, 2.5, 3 centimeters long pieces of lead that were molded and shaped with letters on them, you know, put together and used to make books at this early press, the only press in the British North American colonies, which was at Harvard, first in the President's House, then in the Indian College, and used by John Eliot, by James the Printer, James Printer and Nipmuc Man, and by others to print things for the school, print things for the colony, and print things in Native American languages for Native American communities. So I'll talk in a little detail about some of the finds and how we understand, you know, how we go from artifacts to understanding in archaeology. So this is just the schedule that Caleb and Joel and all the Harvard students had in the 17th century. Harvard was very interested in keeping control of its young men. So everybody got up at 6 a.m. for morning prayers. At 7 they had their small beer and bread. They had 3-hour-long lectures then in the morning until about 11. Then they all ate together in the hall for dinner. Recreation and study until 2. More study and tutoring after that. 5 p.m. was afternoon beer and bread. Afternoon prayers for an hour and a half every day, 6 to 7:30. An hour of recreation, yay, 8 to 9 p.m. What that meant was either doing work or, you know, going outside, kicking a ball around, you know, walking around. They weren't supposed to leave Harvard Yard, but they did have some recreation going on there. 9 p.m. was back to your room, and 11 p.m. was lights out every day. strict schedules. And I'm not sure how they felt about this, but I like to imagine they felt a little bit like this about these particular schedules. That it was a very strict kind of environment, or at least it was supposed to be. Also, part of the strictness was that Harvard students were required, all of them, to write down the college laws by hand. So we have many, many copies of the college laws about what they should and should not do, what they can and cannot wear, can and cannot say, can and cannot go, eat, drink, all of it. Caleb did it, Joel did it, everybody did it. We don't have Caleb's and Joel's, unfortunately, but some have survived. So we do have copies. And Harvard revised the laws every so often, depending on what students were misbehaving. So students would do something Harvard didn't want them to do, and then the rules would get revised, and they'd all have to write it out, and it would sort of go back and forth that way. But we do then have a very good idea of what the behavior was supposed to be like for these young Puritan men, training to be leaders and missionaries and ministers. But then there's what we find in the ground. And so this is how archaeology interpretation really works. We find things like clothing items that are still preserved underground. Fancy buttons, fancy buckles, things like wig curlers. This is a fragment of kind of a barbell-shaped ceramic wig curler. You heat it, you curl your wig, you look really fancy. This little piece here is actually made of silver, and it's a bob for a piece of jewelry, probably for an earring. None of this is what young Puritan boys were supposed to be wearing. They were supposed to be wearing modest and somber habit without newfangled or ruffian-like attire whatsoever. In the laws, they all wrote it down. Ear bobs and wigs count as ruffian-like and newfangled, unfortunately. So, someone on campus was not dressing soberly enough for the authorities at Harvard. So we've got a little difference, a little space between what they were supposed to be doing and what the evidence suggests that they were doing. And this portrait here shows more what the students should have been looking like here, and this flamboyance going on here is a little bit more like what we're getting out of the ground sometimes, so not quite matching up. Yeah.
What's the artifact in the upper right-hand corner?
Oh yeah, sure. This is a little, it's a lead seal from a bale of cloth.
Oh.
So it's actually evidence of sort of trade and mercantilism and tying back to England. That was also found in Harvard Yard. So someone was bringing in whole, bales or bolts of cloth. We don't know if they were, hiring people to make these black coats that everybody had to wear all the time and the hats that everybody had to wear all the time. Maybe they were making them on campus. So we're not sure what fabric this was yet or what it was used for, but it's definitely an area for future research. Yeah. This is a little bit more like what they should be looking like too, although he does have some, Adam Wynn here does have some fancy button action going on. But we're dealing with Puritans. Puritan religion, is a pretty strict religion, but one of the other artifacts that's been found, in this case near the Old College cellar, is this coin here, which is a 17th century farthing. It's got a hole in it. It's a pierced coin. So I don't know if anybody here has ever worn religious medals or medallions or pierced coins, or has at least heard of wearing these things for luck, for protection, for something. There's an English tradition of doing this. It's not something good Puritans should be doing, however. If you really believe and have faith in, Jesus Christ and the Lord in your prayers, and you take care of yourself bodily by taking care of yourself spiritually, you shouldn't be worried about this. But somebody at Harvard was worried about this and wore and eventually lost this very worn farthing with the hole pierced in it. So that's, again, starting to give us a little more complicated idea of the lives of these young men at the school than we might have otherwise. The spoon, which I showed you earlier, here's another view of that. This is the base of a drinking mug that some young man has scratched his initial into. As I said, Harvard didn't give you your mugs, didn't give you your utensils, you had to bring them. So in the dining hall here of the Old College, where everybody ate, you would potentially have your individual cups at risk of being pilfered or stolen or lost or something. So, we write our names on stuff now. Harvard students are still writing their names on their coffee mugs. Harvard's trying to reduce its it's a carbon footprint, it's trash footprint, so it's encouraging students to reuse mugs and water bottles and things, and they're writing their names on everything again, just like they did in the 17th century. So it's very lovely when we get these artifacts that have that real personal element, like the very worn spoon or the initial scratch in the bottom of a mug. It's a very nice intimate connection with the actual individuals from the past. Some of the other artifacts we find involve drinking and smoking. Students could drink beer, thumbs up, wine and gin, thumbs down. There's a mixture of these things, however, going on. We do find beer bottles, like this German example here. You can see a parallel in this Dutch painting from the 1630s. We also find quite a number of smoking pipes, which students were not supposed to do. Students were forbidden from smoking unless they had a note from a parent or a doctor, then they could smoke. Tobacco at the time was increasingly popular, but people weren't really sure of it yet. It was believed to have medicinal qualities. Sure, that definitely changes how you feel. It had a much longer tradition in Native American communities as sort of a spiritual and cleansing and communal kind of an activity, smoking. But Harvard authorities weren't too sure about it, and they certainly did not want the young men smoking if they could avoid it. And yet we do find quite a number of tobacco pipes at the excavations there in Harvard Yard. And as I said, quite a lot of drinking paraphernalia also, not just beer, but wine. This is a drawer. There are 7 more, just like this, of wine bottle fragments. So some of them still have the wire that held the corks on, just drawers and drawers of this stuff. From the late 17th and in this case early 18th century, and also some wine glasses, goblets, some of this very nice air twist stem and other forms. So when you look at this number of smoking pipes compared with everything else, the number of wine bottle fragments compared with everything else, it looks like a tavern site in Harvard Yard. It does not look like a house. So the idea that these young men were, in loco parentis, and they had all these rules, and they could only eat from the dining hall, and whatever, okay. But you get a richer, more complicated story from the archaeology. And we're able to, again, get a little bit more at what life was like for these students, not just what was written, but what was actually going on, which is always fun. And the students, when they dig up Harvard Yard, really enjoyed this piece of the story, kind of more than other pieces of the story.
Yes, students get care packages from home, and the parents drop by and perhaps...
I don't know. That's an interesting question. They might have done. Harvard definitely had a commissary of the buttery where you could go buy stuff, not gin per se, not tobacco that we know of per se, but you could buy other things. So students also kind of snuck out and went into Cambridge and went to the ordinaries and the taverns and things in Cambridge as well. So it's possible they get some stuff from parents, but there is enough motivation, we can call it, to procure items for themselves as well, for sure. This is just a representation of what I think some nights at Harvard might have looked like. This is Hogarth's 1730 Midnight Modern Conversation, which is a very iconic scene. But in terms of the numbers of, smoking pipes and wine bottles, and everything's broken, and so it's not that much of a stretch to kind of get to here in your heads. And finally, one of the most iconic artifacts then is the printing type. So I mentioned that we found this in the Indian College Trench. Pieces of it have been found in other locations, including where the press used to be, in the President's House, Paintree House. At this point, we have several pieces of these, the actual lead printing types. Some of them are very worn, some of them look like they're broken. Some of them are intact enough, however, that experts have been able to match the font to the font of books that we have at Harvard, and other places have these as well. Books that we know were printed at the Harvard Press. So we can say that this type is from a set that was used in this year to print this volume. This is an example of one of them, which is this little, you can't see, it's sort of on the side here, but it's this little L that matches this L, which is a small font, 22-point font, double pica, that was used on a page of the 1666 volume, The Indian Grammar Begun, by missionary John Eliot. It was printed by the Nipmuc man James Printer. He typeset it all. He could, read English, read the native language, Algonquian, local dialects of it, typeset everything. They had little introductions in English, and then we're also trying to teach English people to speak Algonquian and teach people who could speak Algonquian how to read Algonquian and read and speak English as well. So there were nearly 30 books published in the Algonquian language at the Indian College, including the first Bible printed in the British colonies. So this is just a slide about literacy rates. At the praying town communities, Christian native communities in New England, the literacy rates of men and women who were Native American were about half of what they were for the English, but they were still relatively high. 30% of men could read and write. 30% could read, 14% could write in Algonquian, not English. Only 2% English, but more in Algonquian. So this was a spoken language that when the English got here, and with a lot of Native help, obviously, they transformed into a written language that then was used by the communities within the English system of deeds and courts and inheritance and religion and education and all of that. And this is that Bible I mentioned. So the first Bible printed was at Harvard in the Indian College in 1663, and by John Eliot with James Printer and other help. And that's the first Bible we got in the Puritan New England colonies. Not King James, not nothing. It was this Algonquian Bible. And so that's, again, we knew this through the documents, but the archaeology and finding the printing type is reminding us of what happened. So finally, to talk a little bit about some of the legacies of all of this work, of the archaeology and working with Native communities, reinvestigating this history, reminding Harvard about its charter to educate English and Native youth. There's a lot of importance that the past can have in the present. It can do work in the present to sort of change people's minds and remind us about certain things. So if these were the questions we have, we've been able to use archaeology along with documents and oral traditions to talk a little bit about what 17th century New England was like, what Harvard was like in the mid-17th century for Caleb and Joel and other students as well, and what life specifically at the Indian College was like, with the press and the ground floor and a couple, young Native men living upstairs, going across to the English college, the old college, for meals and for prayer and back again, and all of those kind of dynamics of daily life. We do have, to commemorate this history, there's a plaque that was put up in the 1990s before we started this archaeology, but near where we believe the Indian College to be. So that's one of the ways it's marked on the Harvard landscape. Although a lot of people don't notice the plaque or don't read it if they do. It's a lot easier when we have something going on there, like archaeology, to talk about this story. Or in this case, in 2011 for Arts First, some students from the Harvard University Native American program, so some of our young Native people on campus, as well as some interpreters from Plymouth Plantation and other Wampanoag folks came and built a Witu, one of these native dwellings that was on that 1635 map. They're still built, people still know how to build them, so they built one on the site of the Indian College to mark its history, to mark the fact that you might not think about it, but Harvard and Cambridge and all of this land was and is Native land also, to mark the connections between Harvard and its history and then Native communities in New England as well. So it's another legacy our project has been able to contribute to. Just having the archaeology out there is a way to get the story out and talk to people. We have ceremonies on site, we have open houses for the public, we do all of those sorts of things. These are some of the students from the 2011 school. This is Harvard University President Drew Faust, who wore gloves, but besides that actually got our hands dirty, doing a little sifting in the archaeology. So really trying to connect what we're doing to the school and what it means to be at Harvard today. We're working on educational programs using the archaeology for school children to teach them about history and about archaeology, and how artifacts can be used to help broaden understandings. There's a bunch of books that you can read that are related to this project. Certainly Caleb's Crossing. But besides that, there's a chapter about Harvard archaeology in the book Beneath the Ivory Tower. 3 Centuries of Harvard was written in the 1930s from a of the past kind of biased viewpoint, but it does summarize 300 years of Harvard history and is a fascinating read about anecdotes from the school's past. You can read about Indian education in the American colonies, and if you're interested especially in what happened after the Indian College came down in the 1670s, sort of the aftermath, the shift that happened in the 1670s with what's called King Philip's War or Metacom's Rebellion. These are all nonfiction books, and The Name of War is a really well-researched, really well-written book about King Philip's War and its legacies in American, sort of the American imagination. So if you're not familiar with what that conflict was, there were Native American, Wampanoag, and Nipmuc and other groups led by the leader Metacom, who the English called King Philip. And they sort of attacked and pushed back against the injustices and encroachments of the English settlements in 1675, 1676. So that was a real pivotal point in New England colonial history, and it's certainly well worth exploring. And then at the Peabody Museum, if you're ever on campus, we do have an exhibit about the archaeology project called Digging Veritas that you can take a look at. And see some of the artifacts in person, play with some of our stratigraphy drawers that show you what you get as you go down and down in the Harvard soils. So that's it for me. Finally, thanks to everybody who's been involved with the project, but also to the library and to you guys for your attention today. And I can answer any questions.
Christina, I wanted to ask, are there, do you have a Native American advisory board that's
not
students on campus
students,
and
yeah.
so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Harvard has the HUNAP, which is our University Native American program. And we've always had at least one or a couple undergraduate students who are Native American actually doing the excavations. Including Tiffany Smalley when she was at the school, who's the Wampanoag who accepted Joel Iacoom's degree.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so she excavated the Indian College site herself. So we work also closely with leadership at HUNAP and at the Kennedy School of Government to talk about the project and make sure that it contributes to their message and their goals on campus to make, keeping the Native American presence and Harvard's commitment to diversity in general sort of active and alive. We also have good relationships with local Native American groups, Wampanoag and Massachusetts and Nipmuc, who all have ties to Harvard and the Indian College. So we have members of those communities, chair people and cultural leaders come when we do excavate and have an opening ceremony where they can speak and sometimes sing and just talk about what the project means to them. And we also talk to them when we develop things like our exhibit to make sure that we're sort of not just meeting our own goals, but meeting their goals as well about telling this shared story.
Do you know how many Indian American students there are on campus?
I think there are about 300 and over 300 at this point, not just undergraduate, but in all the different schools, so divinity school, education.
How many students does Harvard have?
16,000.
16,000. I guess
so
it would
it's
be,
not a huge. It's like 2%. I think.
I guess it would be easy to be Indian American though at this point, wouldn't it? I mean, in a certain sense. Do you have a definite? I mean, how do you? For example, I'm Indian American because my mother was Indian, or my mother's grandmother was Indian. Okay. But do you have a definition of that about leads you to be able to say these 300 are Indian American and
others
others
well, these
are
are
not.
These are 300-ish self-identified.
Okay.
So that's that's as far as HUNAP's concerned. As far as we're concerned, it's a self-identification thing. There's probably other folks who aren't interested in participating or identifying that way, but those are the ones we know about. Questions?
So students like Caleb and Joel, Would they ever have been expected to record, say, a senior project or something, or write something down for graduation, and was none of this ever stored in the library?
Not a lot of it. There's a couple things we have that are tied to them that we know of. We have, from an archive in London, a copy of a letter Caleb wrote to his London benefactors. So Caleb, it's generally called Caleb's Address, but Caleb wrote it, from Harvard in Latin, so it's written in Latin, and he wrote it to, the people like the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel who were funding him, funding the Indian College. And so it's basically a, very scholarly Latin formal thank you letter from Caleb to them. So we do have that piece of writing, how much it represents, Caleb's personal voice. When you're writing a formal thank you letter, that's kind of a piece of your personality, but not everything. But we do have that at least. And then for Joel, we don't have anything like that, but we do have at our Rare Books library a copy of one of his books that he wrote his name on the title page of. So it was his Latin primer. So the book he used to study Latin, has his name written a couple of times. Joel Iacoum's his book on it. So that at least we know was definitely sort of in his hands when he was with Caleb in the Indian College, which is a very nice connection to have. But not as much as we would, what we would hope to have. I mean, we don't have that much from, these dozens and hundreds of young men who came through in the 17th century anyway. But yeah, it's just, little glimpses is what we get.
Do any of John Harvard's books still exist?
They do.
Do you still have them?
We do, yeah. There's a handful that are definitely from that gift of about 400. Those 400 books were stored initially in the old college, then the old college fell down. They moved them into a third university building that was built after the Indian College called Harvard Hall. But Harvard Hall burned in 1764 and it was entirely gutted, totally lost. All the student stuff, there was student stuff in there. It was winter break, so there weren't students, but their possessions were in there. That was burned. All Harvard's early scientific apparatus, all, a bunch of furniture, but the worst loss was these 400 volumes from John Harvard, which were the foundational intellectual capital of the school. So there's a handful of books. The iconic story is that one book survived because a student took it out when he wasn't supposed to, and so he very shamefacedly came back the next day and handed it to the president and was like, oh, but I saved it, and the president was like, great, here's your library fine, because he didn't have it. That's the story, which I'm sure, could very well be true. But there are a few others that were not in the library, for whatever reason, were not in the library at that time. Yeah. But it was a huge, huge loss.
How many artifacts and how much information from the excavations is actually exhibited at the Peabody Museum?
The stuff that's on display it's a very, very small percentage. Every time we excavate, we get 8 to 10,000 fragments of stuff.
Oh, you do?
And that's just our excavations, and there have been other excavations in the 80s and the 70s. It's just, there's lots and lots of tiny pieces. So there's a selection on display. If you do go to,
What's that website?
Yeah, so here's the website. Yeah, sure. So, or you can Google, Peabody Museum Digging Buried House. And if you go, so we have a version of this exhibit online as well. So you can look at that. If you can't make it to the Peabody. And then if you go to our website, we have a collections online where you can do kind of Google searches for everything in our collections. Our collections are very large. We've got about 1.2 million objects from all over the world, like millions of years old all the way up through contemporary. But you can do, the searches are pretty good. So if you do a search for Harvard or Harvard Yard or Harvard Archaeology or something like that, you'll get a list of all of the things that have come out of Harvard Yard over the years.
Can I just say I was glad to see the reference to King Philip's War. Mm-hmm. I haven't read that particular thing, but I've read some other stuff on King Philip, and I was thinking, that, you know, if you think of the sort of noble experiment that Harvard was supposed to be,
Mhm.
what a disaster it turned out to be
Mhm.
in terms of the United States as a whole.
Yeah.
And King Philip, and well, not just King Philip, of
Right.
course, whose head was put on a, you know,
Yeah.
who was decapitated by
Yeah.
Increase Mather,
Yes.
right?
Who we saw.
Who we
Yes.
saw,
Yeah.
and who was put
Chris
on
Mather
a,
was tough.
and who was put on a pike,
Yeah.
and whose head remained on that pike for what, 2 months or.
At least, maybe
Yeah.
more. I mean, it was there.
And then and that you know, and that entire process is just, you know, then as somebody, the book I was reading on Philip Ward said, in fact, I thought it was the best line of the book, said that unfortunately this kind of approach to the Indian problem, so to
Mhm.
speak,
Yeah.
became the dominant
Right.
approach that was taken in throughout the United States. I mean, all the way across the plains, the Sioux,
Yeah.
and so forth. And
Yeah.
and-
It wasn't
and-
always the approach.
yeah, and
that
it,
became. Yeah.
you know, it really makes you want. I mean, in a certain sense, it makes you think back to this, what they regarded as this kind of noble and
Mhm.
utopian experiment, as you said.
Mhm.
um, and ask, you know, sort of what
What happened?
happened there.
What shifted?
What happened there?
Yeah.
I have some archaeologists who are friends who are, you know, social, or was anthropologist friends who are social anthropologists who are particularly interested in Indian culture, you know,
Mhm.
and that's where they come from in this. You
Mhm.
know what I mean?
Mhm.
They, a couple of them teach physical anthropology as well, but they're always looking at this other side of the question. I think of look at the way this
Look how everything
disaster
turned
developed
out.
in the United States. Though, and I, you know, I'm not trying to change us away from this topic, but rather to look at it in terms of our, you know, our other history. You know.
The very long view.
Yeah, the very long view.
Yeah, the threads are. Yeah, the threads.
Yeah. Do you know, is there something in Puritanism itself, I mean, in terms of philosophy or its
That
severity, it's
justifies the.
it's or the, you know, or the kind of superiority of Protestantism, you know, of Anglo-Protestantism.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly there's that seeds. in it,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Right.
is that they're they were a radical reformist movement to start with.
Mhm.
During and after the Reformation, and it was a very authoritarian kind
Right.
of philosophy.
Right,
And-
that's important, right?
Yeah, and very kind of control and surveillance minded. And the idea that, you know, you have an individual relationship with God through reading the Bible, through your prayer, through your reflection, through whatever it is, but the good of the community depends on individuals, so that you're never, you know, what you do affects everybody, which means it's my business what you do,
Mhm.
and I'm going to tell you what to do. I think that could be part of it
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
An idea that
That's a good
really,
point.
there was a lot at stake when people were, you know, misbehaving or, you know, even drinking, dressing too fancy, you know, not converting to Christianity,
Right.
whatever it was. So the
Right.
stakes became very kind of high and self-perpetuating. I think that's probably part of it. But yeah,
Right.
it's a great question and very complicated.
Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.